It feels as if Sony has been watching a lot of Harmon Smith content. They came out and admitted to something that I've been saying since 2013 or so. Probably even before that, but definitely I was going full tilt by it by then. So a Sony executive came out and admitted in front of everybody in an interview that's being posted everywhere online that Sony doesn't have any relevant IPs. Nobody cares about the exclusive titles on Sony PlayStation. And immediately we have a lot of backlash from this noise. Like, no, you're just neglecting them. You can release a new Gravity Rush. You can release a new Jack and Daxter. You can do this. Like, look at all these IPs. It's bigger. All these neglected IPs are. This pile of neglected IPs is bigger than Nintendo and Capcom's combined. Which is interesting because I'm not sure Nintendo has any neglected IPs after Famicom Detective Club has had such a successful revival. But that's not like a good thing that Sony has so many neglected IPs, and yet people try to make it sound like it is. But the reality is, and this is what really needs to be understood among the community, is that Sony has never, in its entire history, had a single successful IP on PlayStation, right? Everything was either a third-party exclusive, like Final Fantasy VII or Metal Gear Solid, or something that was heavily AstroTurf, right? Crash Bandicoot was never successful. But the developers released statements saying it was bigger than Mario. Well, then why didn't Crash stay relevant after the first 3 games, right? Uncharted. Like, oh, Uncharted, it's so much, it's one of the best games I've ever made. Like, is it more relevant than Tomb Raider, right? There is this really stubborn refusal among the community to acknowledge the fact that PlayStation games have always been of lesser quality and far less in quantity than Nintendo releases, right? There has been this complete, absolute refusal to admit that games like Gravity Rush or The Last of Us cannot compete with what Nintendo is putting out, right? Again, Ghost of Tsushima was hyped up as being one of the best games of that year, right? In order to dab on The Last of Us Part 2, what did the community do? Like, oh, we're going to hype up Ghost of Tsushima. It's one of the best games ever made. Well, guess what? It's worse than The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, a 2002 GameCube game. PlayStation is so far behind Nintendo when it comes to creating compelling 3D adventure games that Wind Waker, a game that's almost 20 years older than Ghost of Tsushima, outperformed it, right? It's better looking, it has better combat, a more engaging story, better visuals, more variety in the items and the things you can do. Wind Waker stomps Ghost of Tsushima. You can tell, because of some of the design decisions they made, that Ghost of Tsushima was made by people who grew up playing Wind Waker. But Wind Waker is still better, right? Again, there was this complete refusal to acknowledge just how none of these PlayStation IPs can compete. Take, for instance, SpiderMan 2, right? Not a PlayStation IP, right? But the narrative among the community was that, well, Sony owns the film rights to Spider-Man, and it's an exclusive, so it's basically a PlayStation game, and that makes this the greatest Spider-Man game ever made. Never mind, Spider-Man's long history of, reasonably high-quality games, right? Never mind that, a lot of those games are on Nintendo consoles. Never mind that all the missteps that Spider-Man PS4 took to begin with, and how Spider-Man 2 didn't fix them. Just look at the Insomniac leaks, right? What does Sony have to do to make a game about Spider-Man? they have to pay an exorbitant amount in licensing fees to Marvel in order to use the character, right? The vast majority of that game's budget went to licensing fees, right? And this insanely expensive AAA superhero slop was outperformed by a 2D Mario game that weekend, right? Mario is bigger than Spider-Man now. People don't really like comprehend this. This is why corporations have to like rely on like pre-existing IPs. Stuff like Hogwarts Legacy, stuff like Warhammer, stuff like Warhammer 40K, stuff like D&D for Baldur's Gate. This is the current state of the gaming industry. In order to get anybody excited about a game that is inevitably not going to be as good as its Nintendo counterpart, they have to attach some pre-existing major IP to it, whether it be Star Wars or Star Trek or like Harry Potter, right? Like they need a pre-existing fan base with no standards to get hyped for the game and to buy it day one. Because if you don't have that, you're never going to be able to compete with the Marios and Pokemons of the world, right? Like, again, they have to do this. And that's why you've been seeing all these weird, like, statements from leftists lately that, like, oh, D&D is what inspired most modern fantasy, even though D&D was obviously influenced by Tolkien and stuff like that. Like, again, it's just a cope, right? It is delusional. It is out of touch with reality, right? And there is this very, very strong refusal to acknowledge that just how much better Nintendo is doing right now. Because when you look at like the online forums, what do you see? Is that like everyone trying to pretend that Princess Peach Showtime bombed, that the Nintendo Switch is on the way out, or that Switch 2 is coming out imminently when that's clearly not the case, right? Like, you have like all these great Nintendo games coming out this year, right? But what do you see in my comment section and in others? People downplaying Echoes of Wisdom, downplaying Mario and Luigi, downplaying Mario Party, downplaying Romancing Saga 2 and Dragon Quest 3. If anything, they're going after Dragon Quest 3 because of the alleged censorship, right? Meanwhile, the same people are running around in circles trying to convince themselves that PlayStation at one point had a really strong lineup of first-party IPs, which is not and never has been true. Sony PlayStation has never been able to compete with Nintendo hardware. They have always come in behind them, and they always will.